Thank you, everyone, for attending. What a wonderful discussion, presentations, and conversation in the chat. It's rare in these virtual events to have such lively discussion and rich dialogue. So it was fun to participate with both the panelists as well as the audience. So I appreciate the opportunity of doing that. I think the panel discussion really set the stage well. And a comment that Marcia made really is sitting with me. That was a good day. But what do you do after that? And I'm hoping that my presentation can help stem that gap from the good days of plans being adopted and policies going through and declarations being made through to, okay, now we have to act on it and implement. And one of the ways that I think is particularly important in moving forward on implementation, and whether that's on adaptation actions or improved asset management, is really through measuring progress. And so I've centered my presentation around indicators as a way to measure progress on resilience, because I really wanted to kind of zero in on this broader systems approach to taking action on climate change. So even through a lens of asset management, looking at our assets as a system of assets as opposed to, pipes, wires, etc. And so I'll touch on that a little bit more. Excuse me, what my hope is to cover off these broad categories. I want to have a little bit of a conversation about why measurement is important, some of the challenges in measuring progress, lessons learned from other areas of measurement, mostly from the sustainability field, an overview of indicators, what makes for a good indicator, and then I'll quickly present some resources that you can turn to for assistance in this measuring progress space, because the good news is there are actually quite a few resources available. Just a footnote about ICLEI, the organization that I work for. We are an association of communities around the world that have made a commitment to broadly sustainability. In Canada, we focus our efforts kind of in 3 areas, which is around climate change adaptation, climate change mitigation through our 25-year relationship with the Federation of Canadian Municipalities and partnership on the Partners for Climate Protection Program, PCP, that many of you are members in, as well as urban nature or biodiversity. We're increasingly starting to work in the circular economy space a little bit in Canada, and that work is evolving. This map is just to show that ICLEI Canada is one of a series of ICLEIs around the world that are both project offices, country offices, and more regional secretariats that cover off a continent or a broader region. So just a little bit of a footnote about us. And I want to kind of start with this idea of systems thinking. And I think Maddie, Sarah, and Marcia really set that stage really well. And I think the conference has been looking at this over the 3 sessions in February, March, and now in April. But to advance resilience through asset management, we really need to think of assets from a systems perspective. So yes, we've got the hard and built assets, the roads, bridges, pipes, wires that are within our communities and connecting our communities, but as well the soft or social assets, which I see as the people, the networks, the services within our communities that bring a lot of life and vitality and quality of life to our communities. So a lot of the things we touched on that were touched on in the panel really fall into that softer and social asset space. These are the reasons we live in communities and not isolated in more kind of solitary nodes around the country. I like to say it's not a question of pipes or people, but both. But one of the things we need to do in order to advance that type of thinking is demonstrate success and demonstrate that our actions are having the intended effects and the intended outcomes. But how do we do that? How do we measure our progress on advancing climate resilience? And that's sort of the nut that I won't dare say that I'll crack today, but maybe start to pry open a little bit and give us a little bit of food for thought in thinking through that. First, let's start with the not so pleasant stuff. Not so pleasant stuff are the challenges. Why would we measure? I got ahead of myself. Why do we want to measure progress on any issue or have measurement on any issue? So certainly we measure to document progress in moving from a state of unawareness on an issue to action on resilience. Why we as an individual, as an organization, as a neighborhood or community, we may want to take action on an issue. Another reason to measure is to document the impact of investments that are made. So most often this comes up, you receive project funding to do a specific intervention. And one of the things you need to do to your funder is demonstrate that you've achieved both the outputs that you said you were going to achieve through the duration of the project, but as well as longer term outcomes. Have those outputs, are they contributing to a longer sort of culture of behavior change or systemic change on that issue? And so that's done at the project level, but obviously within a municipality, that's also done at kind of this divisional level. Is your work contributing to larger municipal objectives that could be declared in your official community plan, your official plan, a regional growth strategy, whatever that is, depending on the type of government that you are. Another way is to inform future activities or to prioritize future assessments. If we can demonstrate that something is working, we should be doing more of that. And so one way to do that is to have data, and that could be quantitative data, but it could also be qualitative data, or qualitative information that the action you're taking is having the intended results. And so obviously that is a way to provide information to support future activities and to acquire future investment and funding. The flip side of that then is once you're working on an initiative, all the data and performance metrics and indicator information you can provide really can demonstrate whether that investment has been having the most cost-effective return or the most efficient use of those resources. The more of that you can present to whomever it is you're presenting it to, it could be your board of directors, your CFO, if you're a private business, it could be to your council, your CAO, et cetera, if you're in a municipality. It just provides more data to prolong action in that space. And one way it does that is this broad category at the bottom of the slide, which is enhancing the general profile of the issue and helping it rise to the top of that ever-growing stack of priority issues that we are facing. The other element that I'd like to just add to this is indicators can also help show whether your actions are having outcomes and outputs on different priority areas. So this idea of multi-solving, if you're putting in an action that can actually help achieve multiple priorities, data responding to presenting the way that it's fulfilling that across multiple priorities is another really important thing to help prioritize and raise the profile of the issue. So now that I've said all the good things that measurement can do, now the more tangly pieces, which is why is it challenging to measure progress on resilience? And certainly these concepts are not new to you as practitioners or researchers in this field, but there's a few sort of clear reasons why it's harder. I think on the issue of resilience is the diversity of concepts and definitions of what makes up resilience. Resilience cuts across multiple dimensions. It's the ultimate systems perspective. And so that diversity makes it challenging. We're not measuring progress on one small issue. We're looking at this multi-dimensional and multi-systemic concept of community resilience. When thinking around specifically climate resilience, certainly uncertainty associated with future impacts presents significant variability across not only one location, an individual city, but even an individual neighborhood, but across regions, communities, and entire economies. So certainly that uncertainty makes it challenging to track specific progress. Timescales, climate change will unfold over, a decadal time horizon. And so that is another reason that goalpost continues to move, measuring progress, to borrow another sports analogy from Maddie, I guess, hockey and soccer now. With that consistently moving forward, that timescale piece makes it challenging to measure progress. And the last couple really relate, that are sort of interrelated. So one is, with climate resilience, we're trying to measure avoided impacts. So we're not necessarily measuring that something happened. We're measuring that something didn't happen, that heat wave, or the effects of that heat wave, rather, that the flooding of a community did not happen. So it's hard to provide attribution and causality that our action that we're measuring the progress of is the reason that flood didn't happen. Could have just been rain patterns were different, whatever it was. So that causality around measuring avoided impacts can be challenging. Maddie talked a lot about data. The availability of data to support indicators can be challenging. Sometimes it's not availability, but where that data is. And then this last piece we'll speak on a lot, is a lack of clear objective goals or end states for measuring progress on community resilience. We get asked a lot, and I get asked a lot in my work, to say, what are indicators of resilience? And they need to be tied to objectives or goals or some end state vision to be effective. And so that is all very context specific, and requires effort to identify those indicators locally. And then, of course, the usual constraints around time, human resources, finances, and technical skills around understanding indicators and other performance metrics around resilience. What we've learned from measurement and other issues really speaks to some of those challenges, that it's easier to measure against a clear target or policy objective. The second piece, I think, is linked to that, and I alluded to it, is that people and organizations, your individual municipal departments or divisions, are more likely to contribute data if there is a benefit from the measurement process overall. And sometimes that benefit can just be increased transparency. And I believe earlier somebody was speaking about dashboards and ways to present data. I agree with this notion we shouldn't be collecting data on things that aren't providing useful information, but being transparent in the data we collect and allowing people to use that data to solve their own challenges and work that they're working on is a way to increase the potential of measuring progress. Consulting experts and stakeholders in the development of indicators is another way that we can advance measuring progress. And I think that comes from that consultation early in planning processes, is to build in performance measurement into those consultations. So it's not something we go after the fact of, we've wrapped up this initiative, how do we now track whether it worked? We need to build that in from the earliest stages of planning, so that when it comes time to that, we've already have baselines, et cetera. To that note, creating those baselines, having multiple baselines is important. And on this last one, it's not so much using control sites. So to say that we will put in this intervention in my neighborhood of Danforth East, but we won't put it in the neighborhood of Liberty Village. It's when you work on things incrementally, and you are retrofitting, for example, comparing the functionality of those retrofits versus non-retrofitted locations can help to advance more retrofits if you can demonstrate that the retrofitted sites are acting more efficiently or helping to achieve those issues. And I won't belabor this, I just want to point out that there's sort of two main categories of indicators. There's process-based indicators, which essentially say, did you do what you said you were going to do? So if you had consultation, how many people showed up? Did you have a diversity of people? Did you have underrepresented individuals? You're presenting on the process of the activities that you are undertaking. And then the harder one really is the measures of effectiveness or outcomes. Did what you said you were going to do make a difference in the state of X or Y, whatever that objective or goal you have is? Now, in identifying either set of indicators, there's really some key considerations you need to think of. What do I need to measure? How will measurement in that help you achieve your objective? How frequently should you measure? How much will it cost to measure this? Is it worth the return on investment to start a broad data collection process? Or is there another piece of information that could be an effective proxy that could help you in that space? Is this something that is already being measured? Can you collect data from your public health authority, from your conservation authority, from somebody else who may already be working in that space to help not reinvent that proverbial wheel? And kind of what are the other factors that should be considered? And in that space, there's a well-established sort of body of work and body of literature on what makes a good indicator. And the terms vary slightly. They certainly all speak to roughly the same issues, however. And so these are the 6 that we think are kind of easy to think through and understand. And you won't necessarily be able to achieve all 6 with the indicators you identify to measure resilience, but keeping these in mind will help make that measurement process easier in the end. So relevance, does the indicator measure a small aspect of the objective or output, or is it vital to the effective measurement of that objective or output? Obviously, if it only measures a small aspect of it, it's not as relevant as this is the most crucial indicator. So for example, tons of greenhouse gas reduced is a really good example of a highly relevant indicator for climate change mitigation, right? It's probably one of the largest metrics of success of a mitigation effort. There are others, but it is an obvious one. Is the indicator objective? Is it very difficult to measure using facts and figures? Or can data be easily measured using consistent quantitative data? Speaking to the objectivity of the data provided for that indicator. Availability, is there a lack of readily available data for collection, or does sufficient data already exist and can be easily collected? Related to this, is it realistic? Is collection of data expensive and or resource intensive? Will you have to go door to door collecting information from residents or small, medium businesses, for example? Or are the cost and resources needs minor relative to the timeliness and frequency of that indicator? Specificity, can the measured changes be attributed to a given action? Is it easy to see the correlation between change in the indicator data to a given action? And a little bit later on, we'll get into some of the kind of dimensions around community resilience. And specificity is where you have challenges when you speak to more the social aspects related to resilience. For example, poverty reduction. It's really hard to attribute increases in income to a specific intervention, because obviously one's income is tied to all sorts of other determinants, not just one aspect. And so things, when we get into those broader and more social indicators, it can be challenging to really have specificity around the action and the correlated output. And then on the last one, is it understandable? Is the intended purpose of the indicator easy to understand by anybody reading it? And this really just speaks to that transparency piece. Now, there's a lot of excellent resources around indicators. I'm going to touch on a few of them. I noticed from the participant list that a few of my colleagues from the expert panel on climate change adaptation and resilient results are on the line. So hello, some of this will be familiar to you. And then I just thought I'd present a couple of them. So the EPCAR, or the Expert Panel on Climate Change Adaptation and Resilience Results, was called by Environment and Climate Change Canada. We sat from August 2017 to March 2018, chaired by Blair, who is on the line. And we were tasked to recommend a suite of indicators to measure progress on adaptation and climate resilience in Canada. Naturally, we wanted to keep that list very small, but in the end came up with 54 indicators, which I think is actually a very small number for the task that we were handed, which was to align with the pillars of the Pan-Canadian Framework on Climate Change, which are the 5 bullets you can see on the screen. So again, that multi-dimensionality around resilience. So health and well-being, disaster risk reduction, infrastructure, moving from knowledge to action, and then protecting vulnerable people and regions. I've put on the next slide just a sample of indicators that were identified through that process. And not that you need to use these indicators specifically, but really to show the diversity of the indicators that were identified by the, and I forget if we were 17 people or 21 people, but the relatively large panel to speak to the diversity of concepts and issues related to climate resilience. So everything ranging from percentage of Canadians living on low incomes in climate hazard areas to the number of critical infrastructure in locally identified high-risk climate hazard areas. So both looking to being indicators of sensitivity in the first one, and then exposure in that fourth one that I mentioned. Another resource that I'll just highlight very quickly was an activity undertaken by the Clean Air Partnership and ourselves around looking at sustainability indicators that have existed for some time to examine the potential to draw from sustainability indicators to measure progress on adaptation. And so what we did was we collected information on the types of indicators that were collected and then presented those in a suite of 40 case studies examining each indicator. And so that is where we came up with these indicator fact sheets that present all this information that's on here. A link to our website is at the end of my deck, and so you can access all of these things from there. The last one I'll speak to is work done by ARUP. I believe this was done for the 100 Resilient Cities Initiative, funded then by the Rockefeller Foundation. And the City Resilience Index is a tool to help measure resilience across what they identified as the 4 dimensions of resilience. So health and well-being, economy and society, infrastructure and environment, and leadership and strategy. Underpinning those 4 dimensions were 12 goals that cities should strive towards to achieve resilience across the 4 dimensions. And then the CRI presents 52 indicators tied to those goals. So recall what I said, one of the ideas that we want to do is tie our indicators to goals or objectives. And that's what the CRI tries to do. And the performance metrics are across an array of issues, from sanitation, availability of financing, business continuity plans for critical assets, et cetera. And it's essentially a self-assessment tool that you grade and score yourself according to those 52 indicators under the 12 objectives in this sort of visual manner. So to wrap up, what should you keep in mind when moving forward with indicators? Certainly, it's one thing to just have access to a bank or a massive long list of metrics, but you really need agencies and governments and departments really need to be careful in picking through those indicators to make sure that they're locally relevant and valid, that they're built into planning and action implementation efforts. They're clear and easy to understand, They provide some sort of reliable information that you can use to advance decision-making, course correct, or alter the direction of your work. And as well that there is access to data in order to report against those indicators. I will leave it at that, and thank you for your time. I hope that there's some questions.